All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for sticking around for the day. We have one more amazing panel left. I'm also very delighted to be able to introduce Nicole Archer, who's going to be moderating our last panel of the day, Visual Syntax. Nicole Archer researches contemporary art and material culture with an emphasis on modern textile and garment histories. She also concentrates on critical and psychoanalytic theory, corporeal feminism, and performance studies. She is chair of the Bachelor of Arts department at San Francisco Art Institute, where her teaching explores the relations of politics and aesthetics through critical examinations of style, embodiment, and desire. Her work has appeared in Textile, the Journal of Cloth, and Culture and Working for Justice, the LA Model for Organizing and Advocacy. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled A Looming Possibility Towards a Theory of the Textile, which considers how critical understandings and uses of textiles can challenge and extend post-structuralist theories of the text, while also contemplating the specific ways that the textile works to produce and maintain the limits of legitimate versus illegitimate forms of state violence. Please help me welcome Nicole Archer.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the final panel for the day. I want to thank everyone who's been here with us all day long and welcome those of you who have just arrived. It's with great excitement that I get to introduce these four panelists and their works that will take us to a variety of times and places via a variety of aesthetic practices and mediums, but that will each return in each of their own ways to the question of just how much the materiality of meaning-making matters and how imperative it is that we pay heed to just how unarbitrary this materiality is. And this is what I'll pick up again in my comments at the end. So, as with the moderators before me, I'm going to introduce you to all four of the speakers in advance of them coming up here. So first up today will be Vanessa Kaufman. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Vanessa is an artist and writer who earned her BFA in printmaking at the Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, Oregon. From her background in print culture, Vanessa's scholarly work takes interest in reimagining text, the repositories of printed matter and ephemera, and the flexing boundaries of the physical experience of language. Vanessa has worked for several years as a designer, letterpress printer, and an arts administrator. Her writing has been published in Art Practical, 1111, and Review. Vanessa will be followed by Anton Stubner. Anton holds a BA in English Literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and lives in San Francisco. Prior to joining the Visual and Critical Studies Department, Anton interned at Romer Young Gallery in San Francisco as a curatorial and gallery assistant, and at Creative Growth Art Center in Oakland as a development and administrative specialist. His current research examines visual cultures around the body that emerged during the early years of the AIDS crisis. Following Anton, we will hear from Leora Lutz. Leora is an artist, educator, and an art organization administrator. She is completing a dual master's degree in fine arts and visual and critical studies. She currently works at the CCA Learning Center, where she initiated the Memory and Recollection series of summer art history workshops and assists students with critical studies and English throughout the rest of their year. Prior to CCA, she founded and curated a gallery for 5 years, worked as communications co-chair for MoCA Contemporaries, and as an educator and coordinator for several art institutions, including the LA Department of Cultural Affairs. She is a contributing writer for the San Francisco Arts Quarterly and has been published in Art Practical and SF MoMA's Open Space. Her art practice stems from a conceptual framework with a desire to bring ritual and routine closer together, where language becomes encapsulated by touch. Recent interdisciplinary projects include If by Sea, Sound Poetic Walk for Angel Island in conjunction with CCA Engage, and the Angel Island Conservancy, Inkwell, at Foresight Foundation, and a poetry exchange and installation for the American Consulate in Belgrade, Serbia. Finally, our last student presenter of the day, not just this panel, but of the day, will be Emily Holmes. Emily K. Holmes received her BA in visual art from the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Since then, Emily has worked in nonprofit development at Meridian Gallery and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She currently works and writes for the online publication Art Practical. previous academic projects have examined the emergence of feminist art history as a discipline and the gendered politics of discovering photographer Margaret Watkins. A photographer herself, Emily's art practice explores feminine fabrics through alternative darkroom techniques. All right, thank you, and help me welcome everyone. All right.
Good afternoon. A filter, a cocoon, nest-making material, ghost clothes, molted skin. For years, this object was the mysterious apparition of my childhood imagination, a fantastical object that's utility could have been limitless, and indeed was in my mind. When this object was not, however, sitting just out of reach on top of my grandmother's dresser, and was instead on her body, the fantasy seemed to narrow, a head covering. As an appendage of my heritage that bore no direct relationship on my own physical body, this is the term by which I came to know and interpret these pieces of netted tulle. However, even with this term, head covering, which makes the object's function seem obvious, the garments that were so much a part of my Mennonite ancestors' daily life have for me simply evaded straightforward meaning. Having rarely handled the head coverings that were worn regularly by women in my family for decades, I recently asked my aunt to pull them out of storage so I could have a look at their unique and curious structures. Standing at her kitchen table, she handed me the head coverings that were once worn by herself and two of her sisters. Though the coverings felt brittle and skeletal, they were still forgiving to my touch and still willing to speak as I placed them side by side, lining up like commas or quotation marks. The head coverings, aged from both time and lack of light, suddenly really did seem to be molted skin, only now being the skin of a religious body that once used these garments ritualistically and then stopped. Though the coverings were not necessarily fragile, I was aware of them as encrypted materials that were nonetheless fixed in aging forms. Assuming that my aunt had them folded up as they appear here, in order to save space in storage, I asked her, why are the coverings folded and pressed with such deliberate precision? My aunt answered that her coverings were pressed so flat because she and her sisters stored them in their Bibles when they weren't wearing them. I am interested in both sides of this, the scriptural reference that indoctrinated these objects, as well as the lived experiences of the bodies that wore or still wear them. But mostly I am stuck in the lyrical proposition that my aunt unexpectedly articulated. It is the image of all of these components, words, garments, and bodies pressed together between pages, that is immediately evocative. A filter, a cocoon, a net, a head covering, a textile used as a medium to communicate within and around a collective identity, or a text. The word text comes from textus, Latin for tissue, which foregrounds the word as both a physical and metaphysical apparatus that functions as a binding agent and communicates language. Looking at the covering, my eye becomes aware of each singular fiber that, together with others around it, play an integral role in holding together the integrity of the textile's form. At first glance, the textile's pattern appears to be created by a cross-hatching stitch, though upon further inspection, the weave more closely mimics a honeycomb, a textile of individual fibers drawn around interrelated and touching nodes. As I imagined as a child, there are many functions that utilize the same material for its permeability. This textile is emblematic of what poet Lynn Haginian might describe as a form that provides an opening, or what poet and literary theorist Lisa Robertson might call a mediating skin or a linguistic dermis. In the mid-19th century, when the majority of Mennonites were emigrating to North America and their dress rituals were first codified, an unconventional text was needed to replace the loss of German, their shared spoken language. Begun by Menno Simons in the 16th century, the Mennonites are a sect of Anabaptist Christianity, a denomination that proliferated during the Radical Reformation. Simons was from the Netherlands, though attracted many early followers of his new faith from Swiss, German, and Russian origins. The Mennonites self-identified with foundational commitments to adult baptism, social justice, and pacifism. In Europe, their pacifism required them to relocate from countries where their faith was in opposition to forced military conscription, as is illustrated in this wood engraving from the Martyr's Mirror. This made the Mennonites largely a people of diaspora. In their various emigrations to North America, many mainstream influences began to fracture Mennonite experience, one of the most notable of them being the loss of an original language. Thus, nearly 350 years after the Mennonites' first assembly, and when displaced in new countries, the codification of dress, which included the head covering, emerged as an ethnic symbol of resistance, an intimate gesture of identity, and a language unto its own. Despite being an old and growing religion, the popular use of Mennonite dress was only sustained for a small fraction of time, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. This brief appearance of the Mennonite body dressed in traditional clothes does not endure an explanation of it only as a theological ritual. Instead, I propose that the garments were worn for the textile strength as a social tissue, as a way for members of a disparate community to connect to one another through intimate embodied rituals and objects. It could be said that any adornment of the body that serves as a visual mark of identity is an act of text-making, inasmuch as writing is a process for creating legible space for self-perception and relationship with the outside world. Rather than an idea of language as static and fixed, or something that abstractly controls its speakers in a realm outside of the physical, the Mennonites' visual linguistic system, written by bodies, makes clear that the transmission of language is absolutely dependent on human agency. The ephemerality of this text of garments that exists within a cloth that comes routinely on and off the body says that language too is something that we put on, that we climb into, and that we present physically based on societal or spiritual needs. However, rather than representing a universality of language, the physical appearance of Mennonite head coverings varied greatly depending on ethnic origin and level of conservatism. The white net head covering that beheld my fascination were those belonging to Mennonites of Swiss-German origins, but they differ greatly from the coverings of Mennonite women of Prussian-Russian descent and those who immigrated directly to Latin American countries. Perhaps this code could be more aptly thought of as different dialects that utilize the same vocabulary to represent a local rhythm that withstands and adapts to transliteration. Lisa Robertson defines intimate, locally constructed language as vernacular, a word with etymological roots not only in Latin's verna, meaning domestic and native, but also of spring, vernal. Robertson recognizes vernaculars as a form of language that is composed less by the familiarity of specific words or phrases, and more so as a productive social space, a condition for emergence. Robertson writes that vernacular does not produce identity, but instead nourishes, anticipates, and is vulnerable to it. As materials of vernacular language, the coverings must not be considered to be starting or stopping points of Mennonite identification, but rather along a continuum of the Mennonite history as it has been continually animated. The coverings themselves, even when popularly used, were not productive of Mennonitism, but certainly propelled the collective energy necessary in writing its social text. A text needs a lexicon of words or figures that do the writing and carry out the articulation and action of a narrative or message. In addition to words, texts often rely on punctuation, visual marks that elicit pause, inflection, and rhythm. Texts need context, placement in time around other information, with references to the histories that it hopes to either align with or subvert. In the 1960s, half a century or more since the largest populations of Mennonites had arrived in North America, preservation of a dress code no longer bolstered Mennonite identity. While the need for a cohesive visual language could be argued either way, the scholarship of second-wave feminism and many Mennonites' resonance with it made clear that the particular symbolism of female head covering was no longer proving to be a language that was generous to the platforms of kinship, equality, and spiritual growth. It could be easily imagined that a kind of dismantling of Mennonite identity might have ensued when the majority of ritual attire was indeed taken off of individual bodies and left behind in storage chests, like shadows or quotations from another time. However, words too change rapidly, at times becoming archaic or obsolete, but they are hardly ever buried entirely, especially after they've been recorded, materialized, and written into text. Because there is more to be read in a text than just words, texts need a lingering material host that can be physically encountered by readers at different times. The Mennonite coverings are only material artifacts of a vernacular's energy, but as artifacts, they become illustrative of David Morgan and Sally Promy's claim that specimens of material culture are not simply things to be read or decoded and then discarded, but rather are forms that continually give words, stories, and ideas a time and a place to happen. In this instance, I take this to mean in every textile a text, and in every text a social tissue. The traces left behind in the material structure offer innumerable poetic and political interpretations. The indeterminacy of these interpretations visually proclaim linguistic communities to be sustained only as long as they are embodied organisms. The history of Mennonite dress tells us that the evolution of linguistic forms should not cause a renounced faith in language, but rather a celebrated surrender to the illusion of a static and permanent control over it. Robertson writes that, quote, even the most temporary membranes serve as shelter, and among these membranes, speaking begins, end quote. As with any hermeneutic specimen, the exegesis of the Mennonite head coverings will forever be evolving and subject to reinterpretation, always at a place of beginning. They are vestigial garments, but these head coverings, sheer, ethereal, and mysterious, will continually serve as incubators for new ideas. Cocoons or nests, after all. Thank you.
A blue projection appears on a screen. Standing in front of it, I wait patiently for the film to start. As I watch, my eyes dart from one corner to another, anticipating action. But the screen stays blue, its smooth surface punctuated by black fissures, breaks in the film's celluloid. I become anxious in my restlessness as I begin to fidget. My breathing quickens as my frustration begins to rise, but suddenly a bell chimes. I look for the bell, but cannot see it. For a moment, I'm plunged back into silence and start to shift, but my ears prick up again at the call of a man's voice.
You say to the boy, open your eyes. When he opens his eyes and sees the light, you make him cry out, saying, O blue, come forth. O blue, arise. O blue, ascend. O blue, come in.
I startle at the word you, unmoored by the call of this voice. I know I cannot be the object of this call. The screen divides us. But the speaker's invocation to come in rings like an invitation, and as I continue to listen, my senses begin to broaden. Suddenly, my body awakens. This is the beginning of Derek Jarman's film Blue. Like other works that utilize visual abstraction, the film challenges conventional standards of image production that inform figurative and pictorial traditions. Blue, however, uses abstraction to tell a complex story about AIDS, a disease that is overwhelmingly represented in popular narratives through highly embodied imagery. Blue premiered at the Venice Biennale in July 1993, 6 months before Jarman's death from AIDS-related complications. By this time, Derek Jarman had already established himself as a prolific filmmaker and one of the progenitors of what B. Ruby Rich has termed the new queer cinema. Jarman's films prior to Blue center on tropes of a gay heroic, and in films like 1976's Sebastiana, 1978's Jubilee, 1990's The Garden, and 1992's Edward II, he imagined narratives in which gay male protagonists are persecuted and eventually martyred for living out queer lives in distinctly sensual and embodied ways. For Jarman, these narratives came out of a political need to represent queer lives and the ways in which dominant structures of heteronormativity both counter and suppress expressions of queerness. These films, however, also posited a troubling collapse between queer sexuality and violent forms of discipline in ways that, as Leo Bersani and Ulysse Dutoit might suggest, visually imagine queer embodiments as terminating in violent death. Blue entered into production in 1992, shortly after the release of Edward II. By then, Jarman's health was deteriorating, and he was facing his own potentially physically violent death. His bodily faculties were shutting down, and he'd slowly begun to lose his vision as a result of the AIDS-related illness, cytomegalovirus. At this time, major studio films about AIDS were gaining increased attention in the mainstream. These films brought a heightened awareness and consciousness at a time when AIDS awareness was predominantly defined by news reports, like Lawrence K. Altman's 1981 article, Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals, from the New York Times. These articles informed popular understandings about the medical particularities of the epidemic and its onset. In doing so, however, reports like Altman's also reinforced heteronormative fears that equated homosexuality with disease. As further research dispelled myths about HIV transmission, the popular discourse around AIDS changed, and films like 1986's An Early Frost attempted to challenge then queerphobic representations by dramatizing AIDS narratives in a more human light. By showing the effects that AIDS had on the lives of individuals, these films tried to put a face on the epidemic. In doing so, though, they also reified stereotypes that equated homosexuality with disease through visual paradigms, such as this one, seen from a still from An Early Frost, that depicted extreme AIDS symptoms like emaciated bodily frames, string-like hair, and bruises and lesions on the face caused by Kaposi sarcoma. Films like An Early Frost showed these symptoms in order to reveal the horrifying physical effects that AIDS can have on the body. In doing so, however, these films also exclude the possibility of narratives that depict persons with AIDS as living healthy lives by equating HIV and AIDS with deathly embodiments. The sickbed image seen here reappears in later films like 1989's Longtime Companion, 1993's Philadelphia, and 2013's Behind the Candelabra. The continued reproduction of this trope set a standard of representation that only imagines AIDS through its most extreme symptoms. These images, though, also defined a standard of representation that imagined AIDS through what Joseph Pugliese might describe as the white male template body implied in dominant cultural narratives. Despite historically high HIV infection rates in minoritarian communities in both the United States and abroad, these mainstream narratives almost uniformly excluded women and persons of color from the visual turn. From the outset, Jarman intended Blue to be an autobiographical film about his AIDS experience. Given the prevalence of deathly queer bodies in his work and the prevalence of diseased queer bodies in mainstream AIDS representations, Blue could have easily utilized the tropes seen here or here. But in refusing to engage with culturally prevalent AIDS imagery, Blue forces us to think about the bodies that are not visually present. Instead, Blue uses different sound-based narratives read by 4 unique speakers, Nigel Terry, John Quentin, Tilda Swinton, and Jarman himself, to tell a fragmented and multivocal story about AIDS experiences. For 70 minutes, there are no cuts or pans or zooms. Instead, the saturated blue screen fills our visual frame with unchanging color as these voices fill the viewing space. Just as the screen functions instrumentally by positioning and diverting our gaze, it also becomes a device that, though seemingly static, activates our own embodied awareness of the film's audio narrative. In doing so, Blue awakens our capacity for phenomenological experiences beyond the gesture of the look through an heightened awareness to sound. Film scholar Vivian Sobchak argues that listening to sound both disorients and affects our viewing consciousness. Because sound has less of an implied representational distance than images, it can be employed to create a different felt experience that produces sensations of closeness that images can only represent. Throughout Blue, Jarman's narratives test the limits of this closeness by describing many of the AIDS symptoms seen in those earlier film stills in visceral bodily detail. Amidst these moments, though, Jarman also describes accounts of deep and even ecstatic pleasure and sensual experiences outside of pain. About halfway through the film, the narrative gives yet another account of his worsening symptoms. Abruptly, though, he goes silent until an echoed voice from an intercom calls out Jarman's name. Suddenly, a techno beat comes on the soundtrack, slowly pulsing until it picks up at a rapid tempo.
Impatient youths of the sun, burning with many colors, flick combs through hair in bathroom mirrors. Fucking with fusion and fashion. Dance in the beams of emerald lasers.
As the pulse of the dance beat begins to play, the viewer is invited to feel the same pulse of excitement that the speaker feels, and in this moment of sensorial collapse, Jarman stakes a place for shared pleasure and shared sensory experience in Blue. In asking his viewers to participate in this heightened moment of sensual pleasure, he claims a place for AIDS representation that does not immediately equate AIDS with death, but represents the actual embodied sensations and pleasures that these persons can feel and do feel. Jarman's memory of cruising a club has an erotic thrill because it is highly sensual and wholly physical. And in this moment, he does not specify whom he is cruising in this recollection, creating a deliberate ambiguity here and the lack of pronouns. By refusing to specify a person or object to cruise, Jarman signals that the object of his cruising may be any body, or for that matter, a plurality of bodies, regardless of embodied signifiers of gender or race. In this plurality, Blue also offers the possibility for telling stories about AIDS that are not delimited by the external representations or normativities seen here as visually determined, but are instead open to the intersectionality of many voices and bodies. So why is this shift in representation significant? And why is it important to discuss it in relation to AIDS narratives? Recent appraisal of AIDS narratives from the late 80s and early 90s all too willingly characterized the epidemic as if it were a crisis relegated to our historical past. But in December of last year, the New York Times reported that the number of new HIV infections in the United States alone remains stubbornly stuck at 50,000 a year, despite years of progress in preventing HIV in white and middle-class communities. So while AIDS-related deaths continue to rise in non-white communities, visual representations of the disease, at least in mainstream forms, still imagine it against the reference body of white men. In order to prevent the spread of HIV, we need to advocate for cultures of representation that accurately represent the diverse communities that AIDS affects. And Jarman makes no claims to represent the entire range of possible AIDS experiences in Blue. But in opening his own narrative to these moments of plurality, he advocates for an ethics of representation that is not prescriptive. Instead, he suggests the potential for new forms of AIDS narrative that are mutable, and in such, more representative of the multiplicity of subjects and lives that are affected by AIDS. Thank you.
So for the artist Shanna Horvitz, this is language. One might wonder if these characters have a direct correlation with a known alphabet, but they are not actual letters, but a typography to develop a lexicon that she considered part of her visual language. The language series is a set of drawings on paper created by Horvitz in 1964 at the height of American minimalism, where self-imposed systems generated forms and figurative representation is eliminated in favor of geometric abstraction. Horvitz designed a system methodology that generated 64 combinations of black blocks on orange grid fields, including Language 1, which is comprised of 21 drawings adhered onto one large background with an adjacent miniature. Set aside for 40 years, the language series is shown for the first time in 2005 at Solway Jones Gallery in Los Angeles. Over the course of the next 6 years, the language series moved from these flat paper iterations to three-dimensional versions like this one in 2011 that exemplify Horvitz's power in bringing minimalism to task, rubbing up against the very system that was historically ingrained in it. Here, the typography becomes an ideograph, a symbol for the greater implications that language inhabits beyond text, especially engagement and perception. In Horvitz's work, language is, in a sense, a silent language that does not say anything specifically. It is in this non-specificity where language is read as objects, and viewers help rewrite the definitions of the work by moving the metaphorical language around. Perhaps we take something like this for granted now because we're more familiar with participatory art than audiences were in 1964 when Horvitz first created the language series. For example, if we know that the minimalist tropes are the do-not-touch art world of the likes of Tony Smith, rooted in geometric abstraction, such as Anne Truitt's non-figurative works, or Agnes Martin's minimalist grid structure, then yes, Horvitz's work does look like minimalism as we know it. She's most frequently compared to Sol LeWitt, who once said, "The idea becomes a machine that makes the art." But it's dangerous to equate art with machines because this negates the human connections that inevitably arise. Horvitz complicates minimalist tropes because she allowed people to change her work, creating for them a sense of ownership, departing from the mere visual toward touch. Through careful research and analysis, it became apparent to me that although Horvitz focuses on a minimalist visual aesthetic that speaks in a structuralist language system, she takes it further by creating objects that engage in relational aesthetics. As Nicolas Bourriaud acknowledges in his book, Relational Aesthetics, with this kind of work, we must judge artworks on the basis of the interhuman relations which they represent, produce, or prompt. Foregrounding the usual legibility of this kind of work, Horvitz incorporated a continuous temporality to each later iteration, contesting art's public function both practically and intrinsically. After language was shown in 2005, Horvitz installs this mural in 2011 at a Nanten Zoo gallery in Berlin. The mural is painted on the wall itself. The black rectangles are 2-inch deep canvas reliefs attached to the grid, bringing them a tiny bit closer to the viewer. No longer a succession of characters to simply read like the first works on paper, the single language character is now life-size and something to face. As critic Serge Daney says, all form is a face looking at us. Although formal, the domestic-like setting of the gallery adds to the personal relationship that visitors can have with this work. Natural light pours in from the bay window overlooking green treetops. The rectangles on the wall echo The window panes echo the rectangles of the mural, and visitors can voyeuristically gaze across the way at the neighbors' windows and then turn to language, the eye sinking into the inky surface. The mural is integrated into the space. It creates a paradoxical relationship between itself, the site, and the viewer, and it can only function in this triad relationship. Once it's deinstalled, all relationships are halted. This installation is a bridge in Horvitz's practice between the 2D and 3D works, and is a foreshadowing of what happens in another iteration of the language series, installed at Y8 in Hamburg. The installation is called Displacement and was part of a year-long programming series called Relocating the Self. Y8 is a yoga studio in addition to a gallery space. Here, the function of art comes to bear, and its use value shifts from an autonomous object of admiration to an object of facilitation. The press release for the exhibition explained that Y8 is interested in disputing the separation between art and everyday life and to disassociate from classical art representation. Throughout the course of the exhibition, the 8 blocks create a dynamic relationship between the body's continuously constituted own positions. Rather than put aside, the blocks remain intermingled with those participating in meditation, balancing poses, and exercises. In general, as with abstraction in general, there are no figurative representations in this work. Instead, there is an in-between space where the system resides and is activated by the people utilizing it. Burio explains, it is in the human flow of visitors which thus becomes the raw material and subject of the piece. In 2013, Orange Grid is installed at Francois Ghebeli Gallery in Los Angeles. Visitors descend a staircase to enter the life-size installation, appointed with blocks available for them to move around and to engage with the tactile language rendition. But unlike the Y8 installation, Orange Grid is not a multi-use space, so the ability to move the blocks around falls back into the formal gallery paradigm with rules for behaving a certain way. When Michael Fried wrote in his 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood, that minimalist works confront the beholder, they must be placed not just in his space, but in his way, he's referring to artwork as a confrontational object within the rules of the gallery, rules that historically deny interaction. This denial forces the viewer to always be separated from the work, to simply be admirers of it from a distance. Statements like Fried's have caused minimalism to be relegated to the do-not-touch world. This is the history that we learned and we still buy into. What is exceptional with Horvitz is that she's disrupting both the rules of the gallery and the rules of minimalism. If Fried proposes that art must be in the way of the viewer, then these black blocks are theoretically a hindrance. But I say that hindrance is also a part of Horvitz's language. Like the pliability of language, hindrance creates options and choices that facilitate flexibility, a freedom that complicates the compositions of movement. Horvitz explained this conundrum. Freedom allowed is the intrinsic part of the concept, she said, adding that giving a person total freedom is the expression of the composition. Horvitz wasn't relinquishing her authorship of the work, but was also allowing others to make it their own. For visitors to the 3D iterations, the thrill of doing something that is not normally allowed in a gallery satisfies the desire to partake in an artwork. The rarity of such an occasion creates a strong sense of community, enhancing the artwork's social capital. Art, as Burio recognizes, is made of the same material as social exchange. It has a special place in the collective process. If language not only affects meaning, but also defines and signifies things, then it can be said that language is a constitution of things, a constitution for a way of working. Language is a chemistry through which mixing and matching letters, words, and sentences creates an alchemy that imbues meaning on the objects and things in the world. In Horvitz's language, as with reading text, a differentiation occurs between that which is seen and that which is achieved. The perception of the work depends on the participants' recognition of their own complicity. Art must be brought close to touch, and touch brings perception closer.
At first glance, this image might seem like an ordinary photograph of 4 friends sitting at a bar. 4 white people gather at a table cluttered with empty wine and beer glasses. They look a little bleary-eyed, so it's probably the end of several rounds. But with the second glance, this image doesn't seem quite so ordinary. In fact, the longer you look, the stranger it gets. One of the most immediately striking features of this image is 4 bright yellow squares marking 4 faces. It's odd that the squares of a digital camera's face detection technology are recorded here. There's something wrong with who has been detected. After a moment, you realize there are 5 people. A black man is standing behind the white seated figures, though he's just outside of the flash's throw. His face was not detected by the camera. Then you realize, no, there are only 4 people here. One of the faces detected is a woman printed on a t-shirt worn by the man standing up. According to this camera, she might as well be present, since she received one of the 4 squares, as did the face of a woman who's caught mid-movement. She's so blurry, I can't even tell where her mouth ends and her nose begins. But somehow the camera did, and her face was detected. How can a camera get this so wrong? When we see the full weirdness of this image, we know right away that the reason that the black man was not detected has everything to do with skin color. This image was posted under the title Racist Camera on a website that promises funny memes posted every hour. The captions above and below say, "What a racist camera. Can we really blame it?" Posted on such a website devoted to humorous images. The concept of a racist camera is allowed to be self-evidently comical, as is this image. An internet meme usually refers to an image that has gone viral, though it can specifically mean an image with added text that serves as a punchline. But let's pause here. Can a camera be racist? On this website, and in society more broadly, racist and camera are an unexpected pairing of words. This website text anticipates that racism means an individual's intentional and subjective discrimination between races, something that humans do to each other. A camera, of course, cannot think in order to intentionally discriminate against someone because of race. In part, the alleged humor of this image results from knowing that this error has happened through automated software. Racism as such is incongruous with the expectations we have of the supposedly neutral mechanical camera. It might seem natural that white faces are easier for a camera to detect, since darker colors absorb more light than do lighter colors. However, this image invokes a larger phenomenon in photography's history in which white subjects have served as the unspoken, racially unmarked norm in portraiture conventions. For example, reference models that appeared in photographic instruction manuals throughout the 20th century were almost always white, illustrated here by Kodak's Shirley cards. These cards featured white women until the 1990s and served as the industry-wide standard reference for photochemical calibration. Her white skin was the gauge from which correct color printing was determined. How does the idea of a racist camera change when we think of racism as something structural, as a force that infuses institutions as naturalized ideology? If we think of a structural racism that permeates photographic conventions, then we can think of the machine as something that not only reiterates dominant ideas about race, but produces them through the very apparatus in one's hands. Although this image, and others like it that I will show, are shared in comedic settings as face detection errors, it would be a mistake to consider them as isolated, random glitches. In his foundational book, White, film scholar Richard Dyer theorizes that all photographic media, still photography and cinema, have prioritized the representation of idealized white skin since the invention of the medium. Media historian Brian Winston studied Kodak's institutional literature about color film in the 1950s, concluding that the representation of skin color was a specific priority, but only white skin tones were considered. This history, paired with reference norms like Shirley cards, marks color film as always already racialized. And this is not exclusive to analog color film. In a recent Washington Post article regarding the aesthetic politics of filming black skin, journalist Anne Hornaday identifies the history of white racial privileging in cinematic conventions. She calls it embedded racism, extended into the aesthetics of the medium itself, which from its very beginnings was predicated on the denigration and erasure of the black body. The article concludes that the combination of digital cameras and post-production editing software enables a more dynamic range of black skin tones than was ever achievable with analog film. Despite the improvements offered by digital imaging technologies, black subjects often continue to be treated as exceptions from the norm in photographic discourse. As recently as 2011, an article published on the New York Institute of Photography's website titled "Photographing People of Color" opens with the telling statement, "There is probably no question in portraiture that is more confusing to beginning photographers than how to photograph people with black skin." Although the introduction states that this is not a racially charged issue, the rhetoric displaces black subjects from an unspoken white norm. With this context in mind, let's return to this image. Although the histories I've described to you vary across media and time period, the racially unbalanced paradigm remains the same. Can we still think of a racist camera as a ridiculous notion? This image is one of several racist camera internet memes that get reblogged across multiple websites. Some of the images use a similar concept, but have a different source image shown here. Here, and here. While all of these racist camera memes share a similar face detection error based on skin color difference, this is also a racist camera meme. And so is this. The original source for this meme was created by Jaws Wang. She's the woman pictured in the display screen of this camera. In the photograph that she posted on her personal blog in 2009, she sits in a large stadium with out-of-focus chairs behind her. She has light tan skin and long dark hair. She smiles up towards the camera, her left arm outstretched in a familiar selfie pose. Wang's body is shown on her display screen in the suspended moment after taking a picture on a digital camera. Above her face, with its neon square, a banner of text floats the words, "Did someone blink?" which is automatically generated by a camera's blink detection software. But she wasn't blinking. She titled her blog post, "Racist Camera. No, I did not blink. I'm just Asian." Wang explains that the camera prompted the question continuously to her and her family, but she writes with humor. Her sentiment is similar to the meme I described at the beginning of this presentation. The idea of a racist camera is positioned as a joke. And yet, what this image shows is that the blink detection technology has not been designed to account for eye shapes that are shaped by an epicanthic fold, a common trait to Asian and Pacific Islanders. Media theorist Joseph Pugliese has demonstrated that biometric technologies like facial recognition are based on a white template body. This image reveals how race has mediated the camera's abilities to detect faces. The image went viral, resulting in varying memes that recirculate racist stereotypes. The popularity of this meme even received mainstream media attention from Time magazine, which included an interview with Wang. In this article, her image is compared to another racialized technology error that was going viral at the same time. Maybe some of you have heard about this one, since it received hundreds of thousands of views in the space of just a few days. Wanda Zaman and Desi Crier's YouTube video, HP Computers Are Racist, documented how a face detection-equipped, motion-tracking webcam could not track a black person's face, but always latched onto the white body. It was significant extra lighting is necessary for both bodies to be tracked. In the new developments of face detection technology, the same trope from analog history reappears. The white body serves as the racially unmarked norm. Structural racism gains its power through remaining invisible. But here, we get to see exactly how whiteness functions as the norm. When contextualized as part of an ongoing phenomenon, from analog to digital, racist camera memes enable us to see the white norm that underlines photographic conventions in media, a racialized norm that remains constant even as the technologies change. What a racist camera. Can we really blame it? Thank you.
Another panel of really excellent papers. I want to really applaud everyone today. It's been really excellent. Okay, so I just have a couple of really brief comments to open up onto a really general question for the group review, if any of you want to take it up, and then we can open up to questions from the audience, okay? So, like so much other important work in critical visual studies today, the visual syntaxes that each of you work to explore are visual syntaxes that demand you listen closely and feel intensely in order to better see. Each of your papers demanded, each in its own unique way, that the syntax of modern art and culture cannot be adequately accounted for if we focus only on our overall senses of a garment, a visual trope, a work of art, or even an internet meme. Internet's hard to say out loud. Internet meme. Internet meme. Your papers demanded that we must critically acknowledge the textures of meaning making, and that we not ignore just how flexible or how rigid the various tissues that bind us historically, cinematically, linguistically, politically, how rigid or flexible they are. Your work teaches us that it matters how, your work teaches us that it matters how far you can flatten the text at hand, how close you can get to a figure that was built to repel you, how receptive language is to one's touch, or to the light bouncing off of one's face. I can't help but hear the echoes of one of my own personal patron saints across all of your work, the echo of Roland Barthes, whose call for us critical readers and thinkers, all of us in this room, to attend not only to the spoken word, but to the grain of the speaking voice in any attempt to theorize how our lives are made meaningful, right? This kind of a move, which is so perfectly exemplified in his late work, this kind of a move is key because it offers new sensorial, but also sensual, as many of your works pointed to, strategies of resistance, strategies that account for the material limits and the material possibilities of making a text mean something else or something different. So all of that to say, it seems that redefining the terms or the textures of vision is central to all of your works. That really kind of stood out to me across all your papers. And I was curious if each of you would mind reflecting a little bit on how this kind of textured or material turn that each of your works represents might affect the field of visual studies, which is a field that has long been geared towards rethinking the visual order of things in any number of really important ways. So why is this important or exciting to you? But what do you think this kind of turn means, or why have you turned this way?